Thank you very much, and let me add my thanks before I begin to the chair, but also to the Sri Lankan military for their generosity in supporting and hosting the event so far. So Dr. Fernando mentioned earlier in her session that she had the difficulty of being at the end of her session, and I now have the difficulty of being at the end of the session at the end of the day. So I hope I won't task your patience too much, but I also know my students, being a fairly old school style academic, I know my students are always impatient with me for the poor quality of my slides. So I hope to make up for it with the content, and also I hope that the audience today turn out to be more patient than my students. So we'll see. So the slides, I want to offer them purely as a handrail to what I'm going to say, and what I'd like to talk about in the relationship between peacekeeping and soft power is to think about how to model soft power in relation to peacekeeping operations, to think about what operational success might mean, and the difference between successful soft power and operational success in peace operations, and the relationship to a country's international standing, countries that are involved in peacekeeping, and then also to offer some final words about misconceptions about soft power that I think that's easy to soft power is something which is easy to misunderstand, often because it's so obvious, and I'll conclude with a few thoughts about that. So soft power is something which is, strangely, it's rarely discussed in relation to UN peacekeeping operations. And that's unusual, because UN peacekeeping would seem to be a natural home for discussions of soft power. If you think about, say, what UN peacekeeping involves, the fact that it depends not on military capacity, but on the moral authority of the United Nations, the fact that so much peacekeeping work on the ground depends upon persuasion, the fact that it's that if you think about the classical legitimacy of UN peacekeeping, it's based on drawing its personnel from neutral or non-aligned countries. It relies on its forces being comparatively less well armed than a conventional military operation. The fact that it depends on the consent of the host country where it deploys, so peacekeepers aren't expected to fight into the theater where they operate. They don't seek out decisive battlefield encounters as in a classical military operation. All of these things would make peacekeeping seem to be a natural place for the operation of soft power and for understanding the success of soft power. And for some reason that's not true, which is to say that people don't really talk about soft power and peacekeeping together. And I think the reason for that is because if you talk about soft power, you immediately then have to contrast it with hard power. And talking about power and peacekeeping in general is something that the United Nations is understandably sensitive about. And that given the fact that peacekeeping is so dependent on consent, to start talking about power in relation to peacekeeping already involves all sorts of political sensitivities and complexity, which I think the people and agencies and countries involved in peacekeeping all wish to avoid. Now, despite that, I think it is worth thinking through what peacekeeping and soft power might look like and how they fit together. It's also particularly important, I think, given right now at this moment what's happening to peacekeeping and how peacekeeping is growing. So simply on the fact of the number of armed personnel around the world involved in UN peacekeeping, understanding the various ways in which UN peacekeeping is successful. So famously, though it's still not very widely known, but after the US, it's the United Nations that deploys the most armed personnel around the world. Over 100,000 UN peacekeepers are currently deployed globally, which means then that you have a tremendous number of countries who have significant experience of peacekeeping. You have people, officers around the world who have built careers and have accumulated significant military experience of various theaters around the world on the basis of their peacekeeping operations. So if you think about what armies do and you think about tanks and battlefields and guns and bullets and what have you, it doesn't actually fit the reality in many cases, in the sense that there are hundreds of thousands of security personnel and paramilitary forces and military forces around the world whose actual experience of deployment in combat zones in post-conflict countries is actually peacekeeping. So our expectations and assumptions about what the army does, what military forces do, often don't match onto the reality, which is why I think thinking about soft power in relation to peacekeeping is so important. Added to that, of course, is the fact that the overwhelming majority of peacekeeping personnel deployed around the world come from developing countries, something in the region of 90%. So another added thing to think about. The other reason it's important is because of the continued growth in peacekeeping. So people have mentioned earlier the renewed tensions on the UN Security Council between Russia and the West. One thing that's striking is that despite those renewed tensions, it's not sabotaged the continued growth of UN peacekeeping. So we can expect to see UN peacekeeping has survived renewed tensions on the Security Council, and it will continue to grow. There's likely to be a UN peacekeeping operation in Colombia, for instance, if the peace accord there holds. And we can also expect to see peacekeeping operations deployed to Syria and to Yemen when those conflicts finally come to an end. And in all likelihood, they'll draw on the experience of the missions that are currently deployed in Central African Republic and Mali. And my expectation would be that those will be the models for the operations that will be deployed to the Middle East after the end of the civil wars in those countries. So another reason to understand soft power and peacekeeping is that peacekeeping is going to grow. And I expect in the next few years, you'll probably see peacekeeping reaching even greater heights in terms of the number of personnel deployed than it has at the moment, which is already at an unprecedented peak. So understanding the dynamics of success is particularly important for those reasons. I should also add, we might even see peacekeepers deployed to Ukraine, which is also a possibility. So another thing to think about. So what I want to do is to think about soft power and peacekeeping on two levels. One in relation to the country that deploys peacekeepers, and the other in relation to soft power and operational success. So in terms of the contributing country that's involved in peacekeeping and how it might translate into soft power, the element that's overlooked, overwhelmingly overlooked in understanding it, is the corridor diplomacy aspect of peacekeeping, the connections that participating in peacekeeping operations provides for countries' diplomats, for their defense councils appointed to their missions in New York, for the interaction that might happen politically between embassies or in capital cities of contributing countries. And this is intangible but tremendously important asset, I think, for the countries that are involved, and one that's overlooked. So if you ask people why do developing countries contribute to peacekeeping, often people assume, at least outside developing countries, which is to say in the West, people assume that developing countries do peacekeeping for the money, which is not only patronizing, but also substantially inaccurate, in the sense that the benefits that come from peacekeeping a lot of them are intangible, and a lot of them are related to soft power. And corridor diplomacy in the UN, in capital cities, access, connections, being able to brief the UN Security Council, being able to participate in discussions, being involved in liaising with the Department of Peacekeeping Operations and field support, these are the things I think that matter tremendously to the diplomacy of contributing countries. The other element is on the international level, it allows contributing countries to cultivate an image of international responsibility and contributing. And I think that's, again, tremendously important for countries like Bangladesh, for countries like Pakistan, like India, like Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, all of these leading members of the UN peacekeeping contributors. Their international image that they can cultivate through participation is tremendously important to their international profile, even if it's not so important domestically. The soft power connections abroad matter importantly. It's also there has a self-reinforcing dynamic, in the sense that you have an internationalized cadre of officers who have experience of varied theaters, experience of working with militaries from around the world. Perhaps if they've attended peacekeeping training schools in South Asia or abroad, they also have the experience of working with other countries' militaries and training with other countries' militaries. And this also, again, helps reinforce that connectivity, the appeal that they might be able to convey about their own country and its contribution. So these are the soft power aspects of UN peacekeeping as regards contributing countries. In terms of the peace operation itself, it's more difficult. And I just want to offer some kind of caveats before talking about it, which is to say it's difficult to measure soft power and peacekeeping operations in the field. If you look at the way soft power is measured, they give opinion polls of what do you think about the United States, for instance. And obviously it's difficult to do that in somewhere like Somalia or somewhere like Sierra Leone after a conflict has recently ended. What do you think about the UN peacekeeping operation? So the usual ways in which soft power is measured is difficult to conduct. So that makes it difficult to collect evidence, which means plenty of it is anecdotal and unsystematic, impressionistic, but nonetheless I think it's worth giving some of those examples, even if we have to accept that the evidence is not as systematic as we might like. It's also, soft power in peacekeeping is different from the usual discussions of peacekeeping success, which is usually measured by whether or not the number of fatalities decline after peacekeepers are deployed in a particular area, how clear a particular UN mandate is, whether the mandate empowers UN peacekeepers to use force beyond self-defense. These are the usual ways in which peacekeeping success is measured. So soft power isn't usually done, and I want to suggest that it should perhaps be included in the mix of measuring UN peacekeeping success. The final thing is, and this is to think about in relation to these examples I'm going to give you, is whether soft power success in peacekeeping operations translates into operational success. And that's not necessarily clear at all. So if you think about, for example, there's one famous example which is always used, which is Sierra Leone made Bengali, Bangladeshi, and second language of Sierra Leone in a kind of honorary gesture of of gratitude to Bangladesh for the extensive support that Bangladesh has given to Sierra Leone through its contributions to the United Nations in the field. Another example was Brazilians in Haiti. So I was very skeptical about this, but I had it on good authority from somebody who was in Haiti, talking about how much Haitians appreciated interacting with Brazilian forces on the basis of Brazilian football. Knowing about Brazilian football and Brazilian carnival keyed into popular Haitian expectations, which made it easier to some degree for Brazilian peacekeepers to interact with local people in Port-au-Prince and other places in Haiti. Another example, which is a bit more ambiguous, is that the Chadians have a high reputation in their deployments in Central Africa. Counterintuitively, because they also have a reputation for being the most forceful, the most willing to use hard power. And precisely because of that, according to people on the ground, people who've deployed in these operations, they say the Chadians are also appreciated by people on the ground for precisely that reason. Generally, African peacekeepers are seen to be more successful in African conflicts for obvious reasons, to build African confidence in African solutions to African problems, and to avoid repeating the colonial era legacies. That's obvious. Another example is how in African conflicts, again, having Muslim peacekeepers deployed in countries with Muslim populations is also a significant boon to the operation and makes it easier for peacekeepers to interact with the local population. And then finally, an example that's been raised earlier in discussions is reconstruction. So the Chinese have developed a reputation for their involvement in infrastructural projects in Africa with their massive investments there, but also they frequently deploy engineers, logistical units, rebuilding bridges, wells, roads, deploying field hospitals, and these are obviously tremendously important enabling units as part of peacekeeping operations, but also helps the soft power aspects of an operation. Now, all of these examples don't necessarily amount to operational success. It's difficult to count the Haitian operation, however successful the Brazilians might be at interacting with the local population, of the reputation of Brazilian footballers, it doesn't mean that the UN mission in Haiti was a success. Quite the opposite, because it's only recently that the evidence has become incontrovertible that the UN's mismanagement of waste disposal facilities contributed directly to the cholera outbreak in Haiti, for instance. So it would be difficult you couldn't in good faith call the operation a success given the aftermath of the cholera outbreak. So my point is that these examples of soft power success in operations don't necessarily mean operational success. So harnessing the soft power potential of these examples and the soft power potential of peacekeeping, translating that into operational success in the field is different from how countries' soft power might work and the successes that they might get in corridor diplomacy in the UN that might not translate into actual success in the field. So that's something to think about, and I don't have an answer to it, but it's, I guess, the issue to put to the people who would be thinking of doing peacekeeping and who think about operational issues to do with peacekeeping, is how that might be translated into actual operational success. And then finally, well, there's doctrine in civil military relations, which is just to say that certain peacekeepers' doctrine have their experience of nation-building operations, their experience of counterinsurgency. The particular doctrinal aspects of that also have soft power implications. And that's something to think about in relation to military training, but I'm not going to go into that into great detail. What I want to give some concluding thoughts on is the reality of soft power. And what I mean by this is not to get into the debate of how real it is compared to hard power or how we might measure it, but it's to think about its, when it works, how it's actually working. And I think it's easy to overlook. What I'm going to say might seem obvious, but perhaps it's, I think precisely for that reason, it's easy to overlook and easy to misconceive. Because when we say power, it suggests conspiracy, control, direction, and planning. It suggests that soft power is a matter of deception, that it's a matter of a conjuring trick. It suggests that people are very easily fooled into acting against their own interest if you manage to deceive them with a few kind of appeals, some kind of claim to attraction. And I think that's easy to mistake and easy to misunderstand. So if we take some of the classical examples of soft power taken from the US, for example, Coca-Cola, the reason, if Coca-Cola contributes at all to US soft power, the reason it does so is because it's a fantastic, refreshing soft drink. That's the truth, right? It's a genuinely great drink. The reason Levi jeans contribute to US soft power is because it's genuinely great fashion. It has universal appeal, it's versatile, it's something which looks good on whoever's wearing it. The reason Hollywood contributes to US soft power is because Hollywood films are genuinely fantastic. They're genuinely innovative, they're genuinely great to watch. Which is to say, it's not something that can be manufactured. I think it's easy to talk about soft power, perhaps in a context like this, and to imagine it's something that can be manufactured with military planning, or it's something which the Pentagon can cook up, or the CIA, or that it's something which politicians can sit in a smoke-filled room and they can devise some plan for soft power. But that's not the way it works. It can only work if it's actually rooted in something which is authentic. So like I give these examples of US soft power because, as I say, I think the reason they work is because it's not a conjuring trick, it's not an illusion. They're actually genuinely appealing aspects of US society. So I think this is an important thing to bear in mind with soft power. If it works at all, then it has to be based on something which is authentic. And then it's about mobilizing it rather than trying to artificially create it. So I'll conclude by saying, as regards peacekeeping, how far you might manage to harness soft power to operational success in peacekeeping requires a great deal of political skill at the level of the SRSGs who are deployed to the field, the special representatives of the Secretary General. in terms of matching personnel to operations, in terms of civil-military relations between officers and civilian staff at the UN peacekeeping and with other agencies in the field. But a lot of it is stuff which is intangible and behind the scenes. And how far it works, I think, is something which has to be thought about more, but is certainly worth if we're going to think about peacekeeping success, then I think soft power should be something to be included in the mix. Thank you for your attention.